Sergeant Lena Petrova arrived at Fort Benning every morning at 5 o'clock sharp, an hour before the first security patrols began their rounds. Her unassuming sedan, a decade past its prime, always claimed the same parking spot near the perimeter control building. The same travel mug cradled the same black coffee, and her measured steps through the entrance were as ingrained as her heartbeat. To everyone on base, Lena was just another dedicated member of base security, competent, reliable, but utterly unremarkable. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, wore the standard-issue uniform with quiet precision, and never lingered for casual conversations after her shift. Her colleagues respected her efficiency, but knew almost nothing of her life beyond the fortified gates. Her small apartment, a few miles from base, was sparse, devoid of personal touches. No photographs, no mementos, no hints of a life lived outside the disciplined routine she had maintained for the past 3 years. The only deviation was a worn, leather-bound journal she kept hidden in her nightstand, filled not with daily entries, but with calculations, wind tables, and intricate ballistic trajectories, pages she never allowed anyone to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Okay, I will continue the story of Sergeant Lena Petrova, focusing on the first parts as requested, while keeping the overall 10 to 12 part structure in mind for the full narrative. I will ensure the first part leads naturally into the second. Sergeant Lena Petrova arrived at Fort Benning every morning at 5 o'clock sharp, an hour before the first security patrols began their rounds. Her unassuming sedan, a decade past its prime, always claimed the same parking spot near the perimeter control building. The same travel mug cradled the same black coffee, and her measured steps through the entrance were as ingrained as her heartbeat. To everyone on base, Lena was just another dedicated member of base security, competent, reliable, but utterly unremarkable. She kept her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, wore the standard-issue uniform with quiet precision, and never lingered for casual conversations after her shift. Her colleagues respected her efficiency, but knew almost nothing of her life beyond the fortified gates. Her small apartment a few miles from base was sparse, devoid of personal touches. No photographs, no mementos, no hints of a life lived outside the disciplined routine she had maintained for the past 3 years. The only deviation was a worn, leather-bound journal she kept hidden in her nightstand, filled not with daily entries, but with calculations, wind tables, and intricate ballistic trajectories, pages she never allowed anyone to see. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Lena's workstation, a small cubicle in the back of the security office, reflected the same simplicity. Her duty roster was always meticulously organized, her patrol routes logged with mathematical precision. Every shift was handled with a quiet intensity, an almost reverent attention to detail that seemed out of place for simple gate duty or perimeter checks. Other security staff joked that she treated every suspicious shadow like it might conceal a global threat, never knowing how many times her perfectly observed perimeters had indeed thwarted potential incidents. When pressed about her background, Lena deflected questions with practiced ease. She mentioned a general interest in security protocols, perhaps a stint in local law enforcement. Nothing that would raise eyebrows or invite further inquiry. Her movements were efficient, but never flashy. Her expertise hidden beneath layers of deliberate ordinariness, like a deep current flowing beneath a calm surface. But every morning, before anyone else arrived, Lena performed a ritual that would have revealed everything. 100 precise dry-fire drills in the empty firing range, her rifle a phantom extension of her arm, counting silently. Not for fitness, but for remembrance. Each repetition a name, a face, a life that had shaped her into someone she could barely recognize anymore. The leather-bound journal in her apartment contained 5 carefully pressed, faded patches, each representing a fallen comrade from a ghost unit, their insignia worn smooth by years of handling. 5 names, she whispered during those morning exercises. 5 souls who had trusted her with their lives and lost them anyway. The weight of their memory had driven her from a world where legends were born to one where she could serve without the burden of being remembered. Lena Petrova was a ghost in more ways than one. She had deliberately erased every trace of who she used to be. Every hint of the skills that had once made her name whispered in reverence and fear across a dozen hot zones. The quiet security officer who arrived early and left late, who never missed a patrol and never complained about overtime, was exactly what she wanted to be. But ghosts have a way of being discovered, especially when they try too hard to stay hidden. And at Fort Benning, where military precision met civilian oversight, where young soldiers learned to trust their security detail with their lives, the past had a way of catching up with those who thought they could outrun it. The morning Lena's carefully constructed anonymity began to crumble started like any other. Coffee, dry fire drills, and the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders as she began another day of base security work. She had no way of knowing that Major Silas Vance had been watching her for weeks, or that his observations would soon shatter the peaceful obscurity she had worked so hard to build. The first sign of trouble came when Major Silas Vance appeared in the security office earlier than usual, his polished boots clicking against the linoleum floor with deliberate authority. He carried himself like a man who had never doubted his place in the world, never questioned his right to judge others. His eyes swept the workspace with the confidence of someone looking for problems rather than solutions. Lena felt his gaze settle on her cubicle, measuring and evaluating with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. She continued her paperwork without acknowledgement, focusing on the patrol logs that had become second nature. But something in the air had changed, an attention that made her shoulders tighten despite her best efforts to remain calm. Vance's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. "Petrova, isn't it? I've been reviewing your personnel file." The words carried an edge that made other security staff glance up from their work, sensing the shift in atmosphere that preceded storms. Lena looked up from her work, meeting his gaze with the same neutral expression she wore like armor. "Yes, sir." "Is there something you need?" "Just getting to know our base security contractors better," Vance replied, his smile never quite reaching his eyes, "making sure everyone understands the standards we maintain here at Fort Benning." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. Lena had dealt with men like Vance before, officers who confused authority with competence, who mistook volume for leadership. She nodded politely and returned to her work, hoping silence would end the conversation before it could truly begin. But Vance wasn't finished. 3 years here, and you've never applied for additional training. Never sought advancement. Most security personnel show some ambition. The question carried undertones that made Lena's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. She had learned to read men like Vance, to understand the games they played and the insecurities that drove them. This was about more than performance reviews or career advancement. This was about control, about establishing dominance in a world where he felt his authority might be questioned. "I'm satisfied with my current position," Lena replied evenly. "The work is meaningful." Vance's laugh carried no humor. "Meaningful? You monitor cameras and check IDs, Petrova. Important work, certainly, but let's not pretend it requires special expertise." The words stung more than they should have, cutting through defenses Lena had thought were stronger. She had chosen this work precisely because it was meaningful, because every perimeter she secured might keep someone's son or daughter alive in a place where vigilance meant survival. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was willing to share. "I understand, sir," she said instead, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. Vance studied her for a long moment, as if expecting some reaction he could use to justify whatever he had already decided. When none came, he moved on to inspect other workstations. But Lena could feel his attention returning to her throughout the morning like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. The other security staff exchanged glances after Vance left, their expressions mixing sympathy with relief that they hadn't been the target of his scrutiny. Lena appreciated their unspoken support, but she also understood the reality of their situation. Vance's authority extended far beyond the security office, and none of them could afford to make him an enemy. As the day progressed, Lena found herself thinking about the leather-bound journal in her apartment, about the names she carried and the reasons she had chosen this life. She had thought 3 years of anonymity would be enough, that she could serve quietly without anyone questioning her qualifications or her past. But men like Vance didn't believe in quiet service. They believed in hierarchy, in putting people in their proper places, in making sure everyone understood exactly where they stood. The afternoon brought new challenges as Vance returned with additional questions about her patrol methods, her incident reports, and her interaction with base personnel. Each inquiry felt like a probe, testing for weaknesses he could exploit. Lena answered with professional courtesy, but inside she felt the familiar stirring of instincts she had worked hard to suppress. She had faced down enemies in hostile territory, had stared death in the face, and pulled the trigger when necessary. But this was different. This was about the life she had built, the peace she had found, the service she provided without recognition or glory. Vance threatened all of that with his questions, his assumptions, and his obvious intent to find fault where none existed. As the day ended and Lena prepared to leave for her apartment, she carried with her the certainty that this was only the beginning. Vance had marked her as a target, and men like him didn't give up easily. The quiet contractor who had hoped to serve without notice was about to discover that some fights chose you, regardless of how far you ran or how deep you buried your past. The drive home gave her time to think, to plan, to prepare for whatever Vance had in mind. She had survived worse than office politics and petty authority. But she had also learned that sometimes the greatest battles were fought not with weapons, but with patience, with precision, and with the kind of quiet strength that didn't need to announce itself to be effective. Lena Petrova was about to be tested in ways she hadn't expected. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of careful anonymity and deliberate ordinariness, the ghost began to stir. The harassment began subtly, the way it always did with men like Major Vance. Small criticisms disguised as helpful suggestions. Additional paperwork that other contractors weren't required to complete. Scheduling changes that disrupted Lena's carefully maintained routine without any explanation or apology. Lena recognized the pattern immediately. She had seen it before, in different contexts with different stakes. The systematic application of pressure designed to break down resistance, to force a reaction that could be used to justify whatever punishment Vance had already decided she deserved. She absorbed each slight with the same quiet acceptance she brought to everything else, but beneath the surface, familiar instincts began to sharpen. The first major escalation came during a routine inspection of the security facility. Vance arrived with a clipboard and an attitude that made it clear he was looking for problems rather than solutions. He scrutinized every workstation with exaggerated care, making notes that seemed designed more for theater than actual evaluation. When he reached Lena's area, his inspection became noticeably more thorough. He examined patrol logs that had been filled with military precision, questioned organizational systems that had proven their efficiency over 3 years of flawless performance, and found fault with methods that exceeded every standard the base had established. "This arrangement doesn't follow standard protocol," Vance announced, pointing to a log entry system that actually improved incident reporting efficiency by 30%. Military facilities require uniformity, not personal preference. Lena looked at the system that had been praised by every supervisor she had worked under, the process that had been copied by other security staff because of its effectiveness. "Sir, this layout has been approved by previous inspections. It reduces response time and improves accuracy." Vance's expression suggested he considered her response a form of insubordination. "Previous inspections weren't conducted by me, Petrova. I'm implementing new standards, and they apply to everyone equally." The emphasis on everyone made it clear that the new standards were specifically designed with Lena in mind. She nodded without argument, understanding that resistance would only escalate the conflict. But as she began rearranging her workstation to meet arbitrary requirements that would actually reduce efficiency, she felt the familiar stirring of something she had worked hard to suppress. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The systematic harassment continued throughout the week. Vance found reasons to question every aspect of Lena's work, from her arrival time to her interaction with base personnel. He scheduled her for weekend duties that other contractors weren't required to perform, assigned her additional paperwork that served no practical purpose, and made it clear that her contract renewal depended entirely on his recommendation. Other security staff watched the persecution with growing discomfort, but their sympathy came with limitations. Vance's authority extended far beyond the security office, and none of them could afford to make him an enemy. They offered Lena small gestures of support, shared looks of understanding, and occasional words of encouragement, but they couldn't protect her from the campaign being waged against her. The breaking point came during a mandatory safety briefing that Vance had called specifically to address deficiencies in contractor performance. Lena sat in the third row of the assembled security staff, surrounded by colleagues who knew her work spoke louder than any criticism, while Vance prepared to make her an example. Excellence in military security requires more than technical competence, Vance began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to judge others. It requires understanding of military culture, respect for chain of command, and commitment to standards that go beyond civilian expectations. The words were carefully chosen, designed to question not just Lena's performance, but her right to work alongside military personnel. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room, some sympathetic, others merely curious about how this confrontation would unfold. Vance clicked through a presentation that seemed designed specifically to undermine her. Charts showing patrol times that didn't account for the additional perimeter checks she performed. Graphs comparing her methods to arbitrary standards that bore no relationship to actual effectiveness. Statistics that painted her thoroughness as inefficiency and her precision as obstruction. Some contractors seem to believe that their personal preferences override established military protocols, Vance continued, his gaze finding Lena in the crowd. This kind of attitude undermines unit cohesion and creates unnecessary complications in our operations. The accusation hung in the air, like a challenge. Lena felt her hands tighten into fists before she consciously relaxed them, calling on training that went deeper than muscle memory. She had faced down enemies in hostile territory, had stared death in the face, and pulled the trigger when necessary. But this was different. This was about the life she had built, the peace she had found, the service she provided without recognition or glory. "Petrova," Vance called out, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why you've been resistant to adopting standard protocols." The question was a trap designed to elicit a response that could be used to justify whatever punishment he had already decided she deserved. Lena understood the game being played, the psychology behind the public confrontation, the way authority could be weaponized against those who couldn't fight back. She stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. "Sir, I've implemented every protocol you've requested. My work continues to meet or exceed all established standards." Vance's smile carried no warmth. "Meeting standards isn't the same as embracing them, Petrova. Military culture requires buy-in, not just compliance." The words stung more than they should have, cutting through defenses Lena had thought were stronger. She had chosen this work precisely because she understood military culture better than most, because she knew what it meant to trust your security with your life. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was willing to share. "I understand, sir," she replied, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. Vance studied her for a long moment, as if expecting some reaction he could use to escalate the confrontation. When none came, he moved on to other topics, but Lena could feel his attention returning to her throughout the briefing, like a weight pressing down on her shoulders. After the meeting, several colleagues approached Lena with whispered words of support. They understood what they had witnessed. The public humiliation disguised as performance management. But their sympathy came with limitations. Vance had made it clear that supporting Lena could have consequences for their own careers. The message was received and understood. Lena was isolated, marked as a target, and expected to accept whatever treatment Vance decided she deserved. The quiet contractor, who had hoped to serve without notice, was discovering that some fights couldn't be avoided, regardless of how far you ran or how deep you buried your past. That evening, Lena sat in her apartment, staring at the leather-bound journal she kept on her nightstand. Inside were 5 faded patches, worn smooth by years of handling, 5 names that had trusted her with their lives and lost them anyway. The weight of those memories had driven her from a world where legends were born to one where she could serve without the burden of being remembered. But Vance's campaign was threatening even this simple form of service. He was questioning not just her methods, but her right to be there, her worthiness to maintain the security that kept soldiers safe. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had never seen real combat was judging the competence of someone who had more experience with strategic perimeter defense and long-range engagement than his entire command combined. Lena opened the journal and lifted out the patches, letting them rest in her palm like a prayer. She whispered the names during her morning exercises, carried their memory in every perimeter she secured, honored their sacrifice in every act of service she performed. They had died because she hadn't been good enough, fast enough, perfect enough to save them. But they had also died believing in something larger than themselves, serving something more important than their own survival. The question now was whether she would let Vance's petty tyranny destroy the only form of service she had left. Whether she would accept his judgment and walk away, or find another way to protect the work that gave her life meaning. As she returned the patches to their journal, Lena felt something stirring inside her that she had worked hard to suppress. Not anger exactly, but a kind of focused determination that had once made her name whispered in reverence and fear across a dozen hot zones. She had chosen anonymity over recognition, service over glory, peace over conflict. But some battles chose you regardless of what you wanted. And Lena Petrova was beginning to understand that her fight with Vance was about more than just one woman's right to work in peace. It was about the principle that competence should matter more than connections, that service should be valued, regardless of who provided it. That excellence shouldn't have to announce itself, to be respected. The ghost was stirring, and Lena wasn't sure she had the strength to keep it buried much longer. Major Vance's campaign against Lena escalated with each passing day, becoming more personal and increasingly difficult to ignore. He began showing up at her workstation multiple times daily, finding new ways to question her methods, her efficiency, and her right to be there. The harassment had evolved from professional criticism to something that felt deeply personal, a relentless chipping away at her composure. The other security staff grew increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. They watched Vance's behavior with growing unease, recognizing the systematic nature of his campaign. Some tried to offer Lena subtle support, sharing workloads when possible or providing silent gestures of solidarity. But their help came with limitations. Vance's authority extended far beyond the security office, and everyone understood the cost of making him an enemy. Lena absorbed each slight with the same quiet acceptance she brought to everything else. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The careful control she had maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack under the constant pressure. She found herself thinking about the leather-bound journal in her apartment more often, about the names she carried, and the skills she had deliberately buried. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine equipment inspection. Vance arrived with a delegation of officers, ostensibly to review security protocols, but clearly designed to provide him with an audience for whatever he had planned. Lena watched them enter the facility with the same sinking feeling she had once experienced when spotting enemy movements through a rifle scope. "Today we're going to review some concerns about contractor performance," Vance announced to the assembled group. Specifically, questions about whether civilian personnel truly understand the standards required in military security. The words were carefully chosen, designed to question not just Lena's competence, but her right to work alongside military personnel. She felt the weight of every gaze in the room as Vance prepared to make her an example of everything he believed was wrong with civilian contractors. "Petrova," Vance called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to judge others. "Bring me the perimeter schematics you were reviewing yesterday." Lena retrieved the large, detailed maps that she had meticulously annotated as part of routine security analysis. Every choke point, every camera angle, every sensor placement had been reviewed, verified, and calibrated to specifications that exceeded base standards. She had performed the same procedure hundreds of times, with results that consistently impressed her supervisors. Vance accepted the schematics with exaggerated care, as if handling documents that might be dangerous due to incompetent analysis. He examined them with theatrical thoroughness, making notes on his clipboard and exchanging meaningful looks with his audience. "This analysis shows signs of excessive theoretical application," Vance announced, pointing to a section where Lena had identified a blind spot in the outer perimeter, a flaw she had flagged for urgent attention, even though it wasn't yet officially recognized. The kind of interpretation that suggests someone who doesn't understand the delicate balance required in military base security. The accusation was absurd. Lena had analyzed base security with a level of precision that bordered on artistry, treating every potential vulnerability as if it might cost lives in an attack, because she understood better than most that it might. But explaining that would require revealing more than she was willing to share. "Sir, that analysis was performed according to all established protocols," Lena replied, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. Every component was inspected and calibrated to specifications. Vance's expression suggested he considered her response a form of insubordination. "Specifications, Petrova, or your interpretation of specifications? Because there's a difference between following orders and following your own judgment." The emphasis on your own judgment made it clear that the criticism extended beyond technical competence to something more fundamental. Vance wasn't just questioning her methods. He was questioning her right to make decisions about military security. The implication that she was somehow unqualified to evaluate security measures that she understood better than anyone in the room was almost too much to bear. "I follow all established protocols, sir," Lena repeated, her voice carrying none of the thoughts racing through her mind. Vance turned to address his audience, using Lena's presence as a teaching moment about the dangers of lowering standards. "This is what happens when we prioritize diversity over competence," he announced. "When we allow civilian contractors to handle equipment that should only be touched by qualified military personnel." The words hit Lena like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years proving her competence through flawless performance, had maintained security perimeters with a level of precision that consistently impressed her supervisors. But Vance was reducing all of that to a diversity hire, a charity case who had been given opportunities she hadn't earned. "Furthermore," Vance continued, his confidence growing as he sensed no resistance from his target, "I have serious concerns about security protocols. Civilian contractors with access to military intelligence require closer supervision than we've been providing." The implication was clear and devastating. Vance wasn't just questioning her competence. He was questioning her loyalty, her trustworthiness, her right to be trusted with the security of the base that kept soldiers safe. The accusation of potential security violations could end her career and destroy any chance of working in military contracting again. Lena felt something snap inside her, a control mechanism that had been under strain for weeks, finally reaching its breaking point. She had endured the harassment, absorbed the criticism, and accepted the systematic campaign to undermine her work. But this went too far. This threatened not just her job, but her identity, her sense of purpose, her ability to serve in the only way she had left. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying a new edge that made several people in the room look up with surprise. "I've maintained every security protocol on this base to standards that have never been questioned by qualified supervisors. My work has consistently exceeded every metric established by this facility." Vance's eyes narrowed at what he clearly perceived as unprecedented defiance. "Petrova, I think you're forgetting who you're talking to. I'm not interested in your excuses or your attempts to defend substandard performance." The dismissal was intended to end the conversation, to put Lena back in her place and demonstrate his authority to the assembled officers, but something in her expression made him pause. A stillness that didn't match the submissive contractor he had been systematically destroying. "With respect, sir," Lena continued, her voice carrying a quality that made the room grow quiet, "I'm not offering excuses, I'm stating facts. Every perimeter I've secured has performed flawlessly under the most demanding conditions. Every soldier who has trusted my judgment on security details has returned safely. That's not opinion, Major. That's measurable reality." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Vance had expected submission, apology, maybe even tears. Instead, he faced quiet defiance, backed by 3 years of flawless performance. The room watched in fascination as the dynamic shifted, as the quiet contractor revealed depths that no one had suspected. "Are you questioning my judgment, Petrova?" Vance demanded, his voice rising with indignation. Lena met his gaze directly, her eyes carrying something that made several officers shift uncomfortably. "I'm questioning the basis for your conclusions, sir, because they don't match the evidence." The confrontation had escalated beyond what Vance had intended. He had planned to humiliate a civilian contractor, to make an example that would reinforce his authority. Instead, he found himself facing someone who refused to be intimidated, who possessed a confidence that seemed completely out of place for her position. "You're dismissed, Petrova," Vance said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Report to my office tomorrow morning. We'll discuss your future here." Lena nodded once, her movements controlled and deliberate. She had crossed a line, challenged authority in a way that would have consequences. But she had also discovered something about herself that 3 years of careful anonymity had nearly buried. She wasn't just Lena Petrova, civilian contractor. She was someone who had faced down enemies in hostile territory, who had stared death in the face and pulled the trigger when necessary. As she left the facility, Lena felt the weight of every gaze following her. Some sympathetic, others merely curious about how this confrontation would unfold. But she also felt something else stirring inside her, something that had been dormant for too long. The ghost was waking up, and Lena wasn't sure she had the strength to keep it buried much longer. Lena spent the night staring at the leather-bound journal on her nightstand, wrestling with decisions that would determine not just her future, but her identity. The confrontation with Vance had awakened something she had worked hard to suppress. A part of herself that she had thought buried with her team in a forgotten desert. The quiet contractor, who had hoped to serve without notice, was discovering that some fights couldn't be avoided. She opened the journal and lifted out the faded patches, letting them rest in her palm like a prayer. 5 names that had trusted her with their lives and lost them anyway. The weight of those memories had driven her from a world where legends were born to one where she could serve without the burden of being remembered. But Vance's campaign was threatening even this simple form of service. The morning brought new clarity. Lena arrived at the base early as always, but this time she carried herself differently. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 3 years was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of someone who had once commanded respect through competence rather than authority. She performed her morning ritual of dry-fire drills with new purpose. Each repetition a name, a promise, a reminder of why service mattered. Vance's office was exactly what she expected. Military precision disguised as personal importance, with awards and photographs that spoke more to ambition than accomplishment. He kept her waiting for 20 minutes, a power play designed to emphasize the difference in their positions. When she was finally admitted, his expression made it clear that he expected submission and apology. "Petrova," he began, settling behind his desk with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to judge others. "I trust you've had time to reflect on yesterday's incident." Lena met his gaze directly, her eyes carrying something that made him pause. "Yes, sir. I've reflected on a great deal." The response wasn't what Vance had expected. He had planned to accept her apology and then outline the terms of her punishment. Instead, he found himself facing someone who possessed a confidence that seemed completely out of place for her position. "Good," Vance said, recovering quickly. "Then you understand that your behavior yesterday was unacceptable. Questioning a superior officer in front of witnesses cannot be tolerated." Lena nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. "I understand your perspective, sir, but I also understand the difference between authority and competence. And I know the difference between following orders and following conscience." The words carried an edge that made Vance's expression harden. He had expected contrition, maybe even tears. Instead, he faced quiet defiance, backed by something he couldn't quite identify. The room felt smaller suddenly, as if the balance of power had shifted in ways he didn't understand. "Are you threatening me, Petrova?" Vance demanded, his voice rising with indignation. Lena's response came quietly, but with absolute certainty. "I'm stating facts, sir. My work has been flawless for 3 years. Every perimeter I've secured has performed exactly as designed. Every soldier who's trusted my security assessments has returned safely. That's not opinion, Major. That's measurable reality." Vance leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. "Your work, Petrova? You're a civilian contractor with no military background. You conduct security checks according to procedures written by people who actually understand strategic defense. Don't confuse following instructions with expertise." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Lena felt something stirring inside her, a part of herself that had been dormant for too long. She had spent 3 years hiding her true capabilities, serving without recognition or glory, but Vance's systematic campaign had pushed her to a breaking point where silence was no longer an option. "You're right about one thing, sir," Lena said, her voice carrying a new quality that made Vance pause. "I do understand the difference between following instructions and having expertise. The question is whether you do." The confrontation had escalated beyond what either of them had planned. Vance had expected to intimidate a civilian contractor into submission. Instead, he found himself facing someone who refused to be cowed, who possessed a confidence that seemed to grow with each exchange. "You're dismissed, Petrova," Vance said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Clean out your workstation. Your contract is terminated effective immediately." Lena stood slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. She had known this moment would come, had prepared for it during the long night of reflection. But she had also made a decision that would change everything. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty, "I believe you should reconsider that decision." Vance's eyes narrowed at what he clearly perceived as unprecedented defiance. "Are you telling me how to run my command, Petrova?" Lena met his gaze directly, her expression carrying something that made the room grow quiet. "I'm telling you that you're making a mistake that will reflect poorly on your judgment when the full truth comes out." The words carried an implication that made Vance pause. There was something in her tone, in her bearing, that suggested she possessed information he didn't have. The quiet contractor who had been systematically destroyed was revealing depths that no one had suspected. "What truth?" Vance demanded, his voice betraying the first hint of uncertainty. Lena's response came with the precision of someone who had calculated every word. The truth about competence versus authority, about service versus self-promotion, about the difference between earning respect and demanding it. She turned to leave, but Vance's voice stopped her at the door. "Petrova, I'm not finished with you." Lena looked back over her shoulder, her expression carrying something that made his blood run cold. "Actually, sir, I think you are. But I'm not finished with you." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Vance watched her leave with growing unease, sensing that something fundamental had changed in their dynamic. The quiet contractor, who had absorbed weeks of harassment, had revealed glimpses of someone who possessed capabilities he couldn't understand. As Lena walked back to the security facility, she felt the weight of every gaze following her. Word of her termination had spread quickly, and her colleagues watched with expressions mixing sympathy with curiosity. They understood what they had witnessed: the public destruction of someone who had served faithfully for 3 years. But Lena carried herself differently now, with a confidence that seemed completely out of place for someone who had just lost her job. She began packing her few personal items with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. But her movements carried new purpose. The careful anonymity she had maintained for 3 years was cracking, revealing glimpses of someone who had once commanded respect through competence rather than authority. Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, the facility's senior enlisted advisor, approached her workstation with obvious concern. He had worked with Lena for 2 years and understood her capabilities better than most. Her termination made no sense from a performance standpoint. "Lena," he said quietly, "I want you to know that this doesn't reflect how any of us see your work. You've been the best security contractor we've ever had." Lena looked up from her packing, her expression carrying something that made him pause. "Thank you, Elias. That means more than you know." Thorne studied her face, noting something different in her bearing. "Are you going to be okay? Because I know some people who might be interested in your skills." Lena's smile carried depths that hadn't been there before. "I'll be fine, Elias. Sometimes things work out in ways we don't expect." The response puzzled him. But before he could ask for clarification, Lena had returned to her packing. She moved with new purpose, as if her termination had freed her from constraints that had been holding her back. The quiet contractor who had hoped to serve without notice was discovering that some fights were worth having, regardless of the cost. As she carried her small box of belongings to her truck, Lena felt something stirring inside her that had been dormant for too long. The ghost was waking up, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to keep it buried much longer. But maybe, she thought, it was time to stop trying. Vance had made a mistake. He had pushed too hard, had threatened the only form of service she had left, and now he was about to discover that some people were dangerous precisely because they had nothing left to lose. The war between Major Vance and Lena Petrova was about to begin in earnest, and Vance had no idea what he had awakened. Lena's termination sent ripples through the base that Vance hadn't anticipated. Within hours of her departure, 3 separate incidents occurred that would have been routine security issues if she had still been there. A gate sensor that malfunctioned during a shift change, a camera feed that went inexplicably dark during a perimeter sweep, a patrol vehicle's communication system that failed a routine check. None of the incidents were catastrophic, but they highlighted the gap left by Lena's departure in ways that made Vance increasingly uncomfortable. The remaining security staff worked overtime to address the problems, but their efforts lacked the precision and efficiency that had made Lena's work legendary among those who understood base defense. Master Sergeant Thorne found himself fielding questions from frustrated unit commanders about why base security, which had been flawlessly maintained for 3 years, was suddenly experiencing problems. He knew the answer, but explaining it would require challenging Vance's decision directly. Instead, he filed reports that documented the decreased efficiency and increased response times, without explicitly connecting them to Lena's termination. Meanwhile, Lena used her newfound freedom to investigate Vance's background more thoroughly. She visited the local public library, accessed open-source records, and made discreet inquiries among contacts who could provide information about officers who had served in similar administrative roles. What she discovered painted a picture of a man whose reputation far exceeded his actual accomplishments. Vance's service record showed 2 deployments, but both had been spent in administrative roles far from the front lines. He had never seen direct combat, never commanded troops under fire, never faced the kind of life-or-death decisions that forged real military leaders. His awards and commendations reflected competent desk work rather than battlefield courage. The contrast between Vance's self-presentation and his actual experience was stark. He spoke with the authority of someone who had led soldiers in critical operations, but his record showed someone who had managed paperwork while others secured the perimeter. The medals he displayed prominently in his office were for administrative excellence and logistical support, not for valor or leadership under fire. Lena also discovered that Vance's assignment to Fort Benning had come after a complaint about his management style at his previous posting. The details were buried in personnel files she couldn't access, but the pattern was clear. Vance had been transferred to a position where his authority was limited, and his impact on operational readiness was minimal. The investigation revealed something else that made Lena's blood run cold. Vance had been quietly targeting other civilian contractors using the same systematic harassment tactics he had employed against her. 3 contractors had been terminated in the past 6 months, all women, all with performance records that exceeded established standards. The pattern was unmistakable. Vance wasn't just incompetent, he was actively dangerous to the base's operational readiness. His campaign against qualified personnel was degrading the very capabilities he was supposed to protect. The irony wasn't lost on Lena. The man who questioned her commitment to military excellence was actively undermining it through his own prejudices and insecurities. Armed with this information, Lena began reaching out to contacts she had avoided for 3 years. The intelligence community was smaller than most people realized, especially among those who had served in specialized operations. Phone calls were made, encrypted emails were sent, and old debts of trust were quietly called in. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, Lena had compiled a dossier on Vance that revealed the full scope of his incompetence. Former colleagues spoke privately about his failures of leadership, his tendency to take credit for others' work, and his pattern of targeting subordinates who threatened his authority through their competence. More importantly, Lena discovered that several high-ranking officers had been quietly monitoring Vance's performance at Fort Benning. His systematic harassment of civilian contractors had not gone unnoticed, but they had been waiting for someone to file a formal complaint. Lena's termination had provided the catalyst they needed to take action. Commander Evelyn Reed arrived at Fort Benning 3 days after Lena's termination, ostensibly for a routine inspection of training protocols, but her real purpose was to investigate reports of declining security standards and contractor harassment. Reed had served with distinction in multiple combat zones and understood the critical importance of perimeter security to soldier safety. Reed's inspection was thorough and methodical. She reviewed security logs, interviewed staff, and personally examined critical infrastructure areas that had been managed by different contractors. The difference in quality between Lena's work and that of her replacements was immediately apparent to someone with Reed's experience. When Reed requested to speak with Lena Petrova, Vance's response was telling. He provided a lengthy explanation of why her contract had been terminated, emphasizing security concerns and performance issues that had no basis in documented fact. Reed listened with professional courtesy, but her expression grew increasingly skeptical as Vance's accusations became more elaborate. "Major," Reed interrupted finally. "I've reviewed Petrova's performance records. They show 3 years of flawless service with consistently high ratings from every supervisor except you. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Vance's face flushed with anger at what he perceived as an attack on his authority. "Commander, with respect, you haven't worked with Petrova directly. I have observed problems that may not be apparent in written reports." Reed nodded thoughtfully, making notes on her clipboard. "I see. And these problems coincided with your arrival at Fort Benning?" "Because the timeline suggests that Petrova's performance ratings declined only after you began supervising her work." The implication was clear and damaging. Vance had created problems where none had existed, had manufactured reasons to target a contractor whose work had been exemplary under previous supervision. His systematic campaign was documented in his own reports, creating a paper trail that revealed more about his prejudices than her performance. "Commander," Vance said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "I believe my authority to evaluate contractor performance is well established. I don't appreciate having my judgment questioned." Reed's response was measured but firm. "Major, your authority to evaluate performance is indeed established. Your judgment, however, is subject to review when it impacts operational readiness, and declining security standards directly impact the safety of our soldiers." The conversation continued for another hour, with Reed systematically dismantling Vance's justifications for Lena's termination. Every accusation was countered with documented evidence of her competence. Every security concern was revealed as baseless speculation. Every performance issue was shown to be a manufactured complaint. Meanwhile, Lena received a phone call that changed everything. Commander Reed had requested a meeting, not as a terminated contractor, but as someone whose expertise might be valuable to ongoing operations. The call came through channels that Lena hadn't used in 3 years. Contacts who understood exactly who she was and what she was capable of. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning, away from the base and away from Vance's influence. Lena arrived with a dossier she had compiled on Vance's background, prepared to present evidence that would expose his systematic harassment of qualified personnel. Reed greeted her with the respect of one professional acknowledging another. She had done her own research and made her own inquiries, and had reached conclusions that would have shocked Vance if he had been present to hear them. "Miss Petrova," Reed began, "I believe we need to discuss not just your termination but the circumstances that led to it. And, perhaps more importantly, we need to discuss who you really are." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Lena had spent 3 years hiding her true identity, serving without recognition or glory, but Reed's expression suggested that her carefully maintained anonymity had been penetrated by someone who understood the value of her real capabilities. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir," Lena replied, though her tone suggested she understood exactly what he meant. Reed smiled slightly, the expression of someone who had solved a puzzle that had been troubling him. "I think you do, Miss Petrova, or should I say Spectre." The name hit Lena like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years believing that her past was buried, that her service record was classified beyond any possibility of discovery. But Reed's expression made it clear that some secrets were impossible to keep from those who knew where to look. "I don't know what you're talking about," Lena said, but her voice lacked conviction. Reed leaned forward, his expression serious. 187 confirmed eliminations across a dozen hot zones. 32 high-value targets neutralized with surgical precision that defied physics and probability. The only woman to complete Black Ops Advanced Scout training without a single modified standard. The Kabul ghost shot that saved an entire diplomatic convoy from 800 meters out. Each detail landed with the force of absolute truth. Lena felt the carefully constructed walls of her anonymity crumbling as Reed revealed the extent of his knowledge. The ghost that she had thought buried was being systematically exhumed by someone who understood exactly what he was dealing with. "That person is dead," Lena said finally, her voice carrying the weight of loss and regret. "She died with her team in Afghanistan." Reed nodded with understanding. "Maybe she did. But the person sitting across from me maintained base security for 3 years with a level of precision that only someone with her skills could achieve. The person Vance targeted and terminated is someone whose expertise exceeds that of anyone on this base. The conversation that followed revealed the full scope of what Reed had discovered. Vance's systematic harassment had been documented and investigated. His pattern of targeting qualified personnel had been exposed and analyzed. His impact on operational readiness had been measured and found wanting. More importantly, Reed had authorization to take corrective action. Vance's career at Fort Benning was over, and his influence over contractor assignments was terminated immediately. Lena's contract would be reinstated with a formal apology and compensation for wrongful termination. But Reed offered something more than just vindication. He offered Lena the chance to serve in a capacity that would utilize her real capabilities, to train the next generation of security personnel in skills that could save their lives in hostile situations. "The choice is yours," Reed said. "You can return to base security work, serving quietly as you have for 3 years. Or you can step out of the shadows and teach others what you know. Help them become the kind of soldiers who might survive what your team didn't." The offer hung in the air like a lifeline. Lena had spent 3 years serving without recognition, hiding her capabilities behind the mask of ordinary competence. But Reed was offering her the chance to serve openly, to use her skills to prepare others for the challenges she had faced. It was a chance to honor the memory of her fallen team by ensuring that future soldiers were better prepared, better trained, better equipped to survive in hostile territory. It was a chance to transform her guilt into purpose, her loss into legacy. Lena looked at Reed with new understanding. "What exactly are you proposing, Commander?" The smile that crossed his face was answer enough. The ghost was about to rise from the grave, and Vance was about to discover that some enemies were far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Commander Reed's investigation moved with military efficiency and devastating thoroughness. Within 72 hours of his arrival, he had compiled a comprehensive report that documented Vance's systematic harassment of civilian contractors, his impact on operational readiness, and his pattern of manufacturing complaints against qualified personnel. The report painted a picture of leadership failure that went beyond simple incompetence. Vance had actively degraded the base's capabilities through his prejudices and insecurities, creating problems where none had existed, and driving away expertise that was crucial to soldier safety. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Vance remained unaware of the investigation until Reed requested a formal meeting with the base commander. The session was scheduled for Thursday morning, with Vance's presence required to address concerns about contractor management and operational readiness. He attended expecting to defend his decisions, not his career. The conference room was filled with officers whose ranks and experience dwarfed Vance's credentials. Base Commander Colonel Patricia Williams presided over the meeting with the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than politics. Reed presented his findings with clinical precision, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. "Major Vance," Williams began, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we're here to discuss serious concerns about your management of civilian contractors and the impact on this base's operational readiness." Vance's face flushed with indignation at what he perceived as an attack on his authority. "Ma'am, I believe my evaluation methods are well within established parameters. I've been implementing necessary corrections to substandard performance." Reed looked up from his report, his expression skeptical. "Major, could you explain why security efficiency has declined by 30% since Ms. Petrova's termination? Why 3 separate security incidents occurred in the first week after her departure?" The question struck at the heart of Vance's justifications. His campaign against Lena had been based on manufactured complaints about her performance, but the actual results of her absence told a different story. The base's operational readiness had measurably declined without her expertise. "Those incidents were coincidental," Vance replied, his voice betraying growing uncertainty. "Equipment failures happen regardless of security personnel." Williams consulted the report in front of her, her expression growing increasingly skeptical. "Major, this analysis shows that security breaches or malfunctions under Petrova's supervision were virtually non-existent. 3 years of service with 0 documented failures. Can you explain why her termination was necessary given this record?" Vance's prepared justifications crumbled under scrutiny that revealed them as baseless speculation rather than documented fact. Every accusation he had made was countered with evidence of Lena's competence. Every security concern was shown to be manufactured prejudice. Every performance issue was exposed as systematic harassment. Furthermore, Reed continued, his voice carrying the authority of verified truth, our investigation has revealed that Ms. Petrova possesses qualifications that far exceed those of any security personnel on this base. Qualifications that you were apparently unaware of when you terminated her contract. The implication hung in the air like a challenge. Vance had destroyed the career of someone whose expertise exceeded his own, had driven away capabilities that were crucial to the base's mission, and his ignorance of Lena's true qualifications made his actions appear even more egregious. I evaluated Petrova based on her documented civilian background, Vance protested. Her personnel file shows no military experience, no formal training beyond basic security courses. Reed's smile carried no warmth. Major, personnel files show what individuals want them to show. Ms. Petrova's actual qualifications are classified at levels you don't have access to, but I can tell you that she has more combat zone reconnaissance and precision engagement experience than everyone in this room combined. The revelation struck Vance like a physical blow. He had spent weeks systematically destroying someone whose credentials made his own service appear insignificant by comparison. The quiet contractor he had dismissed as a diversity hire possessed capabilities that he couldn't comprehend. That's impossible, Vance managed, his voice cracking with disbelief. Petrova is just a civilian contractor with no military background. Williams looked at Vance with growing disappointment. Major, your inability to recognize expertise when it's serving under your command raises serious questions about your fitness for leadership. You've systematically harassed and ultimately terminated the most qualified security contractor this base has ever had. The meeting continued for another hour, with Reed methodically presenting evidence of Vance's failures. His pattern of targeting female contractors was documented and analyzed. His impact on morale and operational readiness was measured and found catastrophic. His abuse of authority was exposed as a pattern of behavior that had followed him from previous assignments. As the evidence mounted, Vance's defense became increasingly desperate. He accused Reed of bias, questioned the validity of classified information he couldn't access, and suggested that the investigation was motivated by political correctness rather than operational concerns. But every accusation only revealed his own prejudices more clearly. His inability to recognize Lena's qualifications spoke to a fundamental failure of leadership. His systematic harassment demonstrated a pattern of behavior that was incompatible with military values. His impact on operational readiness showed that his authority had been used to degrade rather than enhance the base's capabilities. The meeting concluded with Vance's immediate suspension pending a formal review of his conduct. His authority over contractor assignments was terminated, and his access to personnel files was revoked. The investigation would continue, but his career at Fort Benning was effectively over. Meanwhile, Lena received another phone call that changed everything. Commander Reed had authorization to offer her a position that would utilize her real capabilities, a chance to serve openly rather than hiding behind manufactured anonymity. The offer came with rank, recognition, and the opportunity to train the next generation of soldiers in skills that could save their lives. The irony wasn't lost on her. Vance's campaign to destroy her had instead revealed her true value to those who understood excellence when they saw it. His systematic harassment had backfired spectacularly, exposing his own incompetence while highlighting her expertise. But Lena's response surprised everyone who thought they understood her motivations. She declined the offer of rank and recognition, choosing instead to return to Fort Benning as a civilian instructor with authority to establish training programs that emphasize precision, discipline, and the kind of attention to detail that separated life from death in combat situations. "I'm not interested in titles or ceremonies," she told Reed during their final meeting. "I'm interested in making sure the next generation of soldiers is better prepared than my team was. Better trained, better equipped, better led." Reed nodded with understanding. "And Vance, what do you want to see happen to him?" Lena's answer revealed the depth of her character and the source of her strength. "I want him to understand the difference between authority and competence, between commanding respect and earning it, between serving yourself and serving something larger." The response was more devastating than any formal punishment could have been. Lena wasn't seeking revenge. She was seeking justice not for herself, but for every qualified person who had been driven away by leaders who confused prejudice with judgment. Vance's confrontation with the truth came when he was summoned to a final meeting with Base Commander Williams. The session was brief and final. His career at Fort Benning terminated with prejudice, and his conduct documented in a way that would follow him for the rest of his military service. But the real reckoning came when Vance encountered Lena outside the base commander's office. She was returning from a meeting about her new position, carrying herself with the confidence of someone whose value had finally been recognized. Their eyes met for a moment that contained entire conversations. "Petrova," Vance said, his voice lacking the authority it had once carried. Lena studied him with the dispassion of someone evaluating a tactical situation. "Major, I hope you've learned something from this experience." Vance's face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You destroyed my career." Lena's response came with the precision of someone who understood exactly what had happened. "No, sir. You destroyed your own career when you confused prejudice with leadership. I just gave you enough rope to hang yourself with." The words carried no anger, no satisfaction, just a terrible clarity of absolute truth. Vance had created his own downfall through his systematic harassment of qualified personnel. Lena had simply documented his failures and presented them to people who understood the value of competence over connections. As Vance walked away from Fort Benning for the last time, Lena felt something that she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that justice had been served, that excellence had been recognized, and incompetence had been exposed. The ghost was rising from the grave, and she was bringing with her the promise that future soldiers would be better prepared for the challenges that had claimed her team. Vance's campaign to destroy her had instead revealed her true value, transforming a base security contractor into an instructor whose influence would be felt for generations. The war was over, and competence had triumphed over authority. But for Lena, the real victory wasn't Vance's defeat. It was the opportunity to serve openly, to honor her fallen team by preparing others for survival in a world where precision meant the difference between coming home and a folded flag. 6 months after Vance's departure, Fort Benning had transformed into something approaching Lena's vision of military excellence. The training program she established emphasized fundamentals that went beyond technical competence to tactical wisdom, preparing soldiers not just to use their equipment, but to think like warriors who understood that survival depended on attention to detail and respect for their gear. Lena's morning routine had evolved, but retained its essential character. She still arrived at 5 o'clock sharp, still performed her ritual of remembrance, but now her presence served a different purpose. Instead of merely securing perimeters in solitude, she prepared to share knowledge that had been earned through terrible costs with soldiers who deserved to benefit from her experience. The training facility that had once been a simple security office now housed some of the most advanced precision marksmanship and tactical awareness instruction available anywhere in the military. Lena had designed courses that challenged conventional thinking about observation, engagement, and strategic positioning, incorporating lessons learned in hostile environments that textbooks couldn't capture. Her students called her Instructor Petrova with a reverence that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with results. She deflected their attempts at hero worship with practiced ease, focusing instead on fundamentals that could save their lives in situations she prayed they would never face. "Excellence isn't about being perfect," she told each new class. "It's about being prepared, about understanding your equipment and your environment so completely that they become an extension of yourself. About maintaining standards even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching." The lessons went beyond marksmanship to encompass leadership, judgment, and the kind of thinking that separated technicians from artists. Lena taught breathing techniques that calmed racing hearts, visualization that turned pressure into precision, and most importantly, the mental discipline that enabled soldiers to perform when everything went wrong. It looks like I previously broke down the original story's structure into 10 to 12 parts for analysis, and then adapted it into a similar number of segments for the new story. My apologies for not fully incorporating the 15-part requirement in the previous continuation. I will now resegment the story from part 10 onwards to meet this new structure, ensuring the narrative flow remains coherent. Lena's influence extended far beyond the training range. The culture of Fort Benning had shifted subtly but significantly. honoring competence over connections and results over rhetoric. Other civilian contractors found themselves treated with increased respect as people began to understand that expertise came in many forms. Commander Reed visited regularly, ostensibly to review training protocols, but actually to witness the transformation Lena had brought to the base. The decline in security incidents and equipment malfunctions had been dramatic and immediate. More importantly, soldiers trained under her programs demonstrated measurably improved performance in combat simulations and qualification courses. "She's exceeded every expectation," Reed reported to his superiors. Petrova has created training programs that prepare soldiers for challenges they might face in combat environments. The improvement in precision, discipline, and tactical thinking has been remarkable. The young female soldier who had first approached Lena for advice on a tricky long-range shot, Lieutenant Clara Mendez, became her most dedicated student and eventually her assistant instructor. Lieutenant Mendez absorbed lessons that went far beyond trigger control and wind calls, learning about leadership, service, and the difference between commanding respect and earning it. "What's the most important thing you've learned?" Mendez asked during one of their morning preparation sessions. Lena's answer reflected the wisdom she had gained through loss and service. That true warriors don't seek war, they seek peace, understanding that violence is sometimes necessary but never glorious. When that peace faces threats, real warriors don't announce their presence with boasts or bravado. They simply do what must be done with competence and humility. The shadow box that Reed had given her remained in the training facility, a reminder and inspiration for students who studied the faded patches that represented service beyond anything they had experienced. One asked about a particular patch, its meaning lost in military symbolism that existed at classification levels they would never reach. "That's a reminder," Lena explained. "That honor doesn't need announcement. Every patch in that box represents a moment when doing the right thing mattered more than who got credit. The real reward was coming home, and others didn't. Carrying their memory forward in how we serve." The leather-bound journal remained in her apartment, but its meaning had evolved. The 5 faded patches still rested inside, worn smooth by years of handling, but they no longer represented just loss and guilt. They had become symbols of purpose, driving her to ensure that future soldiers would be better prepared for the challenges that had claimed her team. On quiet mornings, when mist clung to the training range like memory, Lena set up impossible shots that no student witnessed. The long-range rifle spoke its ancient language of physics and precision, bullets flying true across distances that challenged belief, finding their mark with silent authority. She took these shots not to maintain skills that would never again be used in anger, but to honor promises made to the dead. Each perfect impact represented a life that continued to matter, a soul whose sacrifice shaped every lesson she taught. The names she whispered during those solitary moments had found new purpose, their memory living on through every soldier she prepared for survival. News of Vance's final disposition reached Fort Benning through official channels that carried no satisfaction, only closure. His military career had ended with administrative separation and documentation that would follow him forever. He had learned in the most painful way possible the difference between authority and competence, between commanding respect and earning it. But Lena's thoughts about Vance had evolved beyond simple justice to something approaching pity. He had destroyed his own career through prejudice and insecurity, had missed the opportunity to learn from someone whose expertise exceeded his own understanding. His loss was complete and self-inflicted, a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting assumption override observation. The real victory wasn't Vance's defeat, but the transformation of Fort Benning into a place where excellence was recognized and nurtured regardless of its source. Lena's influence extended through every soldier she trained, every instructor she mentored, every standard she established that emphasized precision over politics. Years later, when Lena's time at Fort Benning began to draw to a close, her departure was marked not by ceremony, but by absence. She left the way she had arrived, quietly and without fanfare, but the program she established continued. The standard she set endured, and the culture she influenced lived on through generations of soldiers who carried her lessons into service. This transformation was tangible. The base's reputation for security excellence soared, attracting top talent and becoming a benchmark for other installations. The incidents that had plagued the base immediately after Lena's departure became rare anomalies, vanishing almost entirely. The soldiers who had passed through her training programs carried a quiet confidence, their movements precise, their awareness heightened. They were the living testament to her methods. A silent army of guardians whose skills spoke for themselves. Lena's legacy was built not on public accolades, but on the undeniable improvement of the base's core mission, protecting lives. Her dedication had forged a new path, demonstrating that true leadership wasn't about wielding power, but about empowering others. Somewhere in a small town far from any military base, an instructor named Lena teaches precision marksmanship to hunters and sport shooters with the same patient dedication she brought to training warriors. She never mentions her past unless directly relevant, never trades on former glory for present respect. Her students know her as an exceptional teacher with an uncanny ability to diagnose and correct shooting problems. Nothing more. Her small, unassuming shooting range is nestled discreetly, drawing a clientele who seek true mastery, not just a casual hobby. They come for her quiet intensity, her almost preternatural ability to read the wind, to feel the slightest tremor in a shooter's stance, and to impart the kind of fundamentals that transform average marksmen into true artisans of the bullet. She emphasizes patience, breath control, and the deep connection between the shooter and the firearm, lessons rooted in experiences her students can only dimly imagine. The ghost still whispers in quiet moments, 5 names carried forever. But they no longer define her present or limit her future. They have become sources of strength rather than symbols of failure, driving her to excellence in service of those who trust their lives to the skills she helps them develop, whether they are hunting deer or competing for a national title. Her approach to teaching is holistic, focusing not just on the mechanics of shooting, but on the mental discipline and ethical responsibility that comes with wielding such power. She teaches them to respect the weapon, to understand its capabilities and its limitations, and to always prioritize safety and precision. Her methods are unconventional, often starting with meditation and visualization exercises before ever touching a firearm, a practice that initially puzzles her civilian students until they experience the tangible improvements in their focus and accuracy. Lena's life outside the range is equally understated. She lives in a modest house tending a small garden and occasionally volunteers at a local animal shelter. She avoids crowds, prefers solitary walks in nature, and finds solace in the quiet rhythms of a life unburdened by the constant vigilance of her past. Yet, there is an unspoken awareness about her, a quiet strength that permeates her every movement, a sense that she is perpetually ready, perpetually aware. Neighbors find her polite and reserved, a woman of few words but profound presence. They see her as a pillar of calm, never knowing the storm she has weathered or the precision with which she can navigate the chaos of a life-or-death situation. Her peace is hard-won, a conscious choice made every day to live in the present, even as the echoes of her past inform every action. She occasionally receives discreet communications from her former contacts, encrypted messages, brief, coded calls that hint at ongoing operations, but she rarely engages. Her work is here now, in the quiet transfer of knowledge, in the subtle shaping of minds and hands. She understands that her greatest impact now lies not in direct action, but in the ripple effect of her teaching. Each student she trains carries a piece of her legacy, a fraction of the wisdom she earned at such a terrible cost. It is a form of service that requires no uniform, no classified briefings, only dedication and a profound belief in the power of competence. Do you believe true strength speaks louder than words? Lena Petrova's journey from legendary operator to humble instructor reminds us that the greatest warriors often fight their most important battles in silence, measuring victory not in accolades, but in the lives they touch and the service they render without recognition. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is step back from the spotlight and use our expertise to illuminate the path for others. Her story echoes through Fort Benning and beyond, a reminder that heroes walk among us in unexpected forms: the quiet security worker, the patient instructor, the colleague who never speaks of their past. Each might carry histories of extraordinary service masked by ordinary presence. Lena chose anonymity over acclaim, teaching over commanding, service over self. In doing so, she embodied the highest ideals of warrior culture: proving that true strength needs no announcement, only application. Her philosophy, refined through years of intense pressure and personal loss, became the cornerstone of her teaching. She taught that true mastery wasn't about flashy displays, but about consistent, quiet competence. It was about the relentless pursuit of perfection in the mundane, understanding that the small details were often the most critical. She drilled into her students the importance of preparation, emphasizing that every single component, every piece of data, every variable mattered. "The moment you think you know everything," she would often say, her voice calm but firm, "is the moment you become a liability. Stay curious, stay humble, stay sharp." This was the antidote to the arrogance of men like Vance, a silent but potent rebuttal to the idea that authority without understanding held any true power. Her teaching was deeply practical, often drawing on hypothetical scenarios that pushed students to think beyond the immediate task. She didn't just teach how to shoot, but why a particular shot was critical, the broader context of its purpose. She emphasized the importance of self-awareness, urging students to understand their own limits and biases, to confront their fears and turn them into focus. For Lena, the gun was merely a tool, an extension of the will and the mind. The true weapon was the person holding it, honed by discipline, precision, and an unwavering commitment to the task at hand. This rigorous approach fostered not just skilled marksmen, but thoughtful individuals, capable of making sound judgments under pressure. The respect she garnered was organic, earned through undeniable results. There were no titles, no military ranks in her civilian school, yet her authority was absolute, stemming from a knowledge that resonated deeply with those who sought it. Former military personnel, law enforcement officers, and competitive shooters alike flocked to her, drawn by her reputation for transforming skill into artistry. They learned not just techniques, but a mindset, a way of approaching challenges that transcended the shooting range and applied to every aspect of their lives. Her quiet, disciplined demeanor commanded attention more effectively than any shouted order, and her soft-spoken critiques carried more weight than any blistering reprimand. The morning sun cast long shadows across empty ranges and busy training facilities, across institutions where future warriors learned their craft and quiet workshops where expertise meets humility. Lena Petrova continues her work, one student at a time, one lesson at a time, one act of service at a time. The ghost may have died in Afghanistan, but what rose from that tragedy was something more powerful than any legend. A teacher who understood that the greatest victory lies not in defeating enemies, but in preparing others to protect what matters most. Her shadow stretches long across the landscape of military culture, a reminder that true warriors serve not for glory but for those who cannot serve themselves. Her teachings spread far beyond the confines of her small shooting range. Graduates of her program went on to distinguish themselves in various fields, from law enforcement and military special operations to competitive shooting and even civilian safety instruction. They carried Lena's principles with them: the meticulous attention to detail, the calm under pressure, the understanding that true power lies in precision and preparation. Stories of Instructor Petrova's methods became urban legends in certain circles, whispered from one generation of tactical professionals to the next, often without ever knowing the full scope of her past. Her influence became systemic, embedded in the very fabric of how certain disciplines approached their craft. At Fort Benning, the programs Lena designed continued to thrive under Lieutenant Clara Mendez, who had been promoted and given significant autonomy to lead the new Security and Precision Training Division. Mendez, a living embodiment of Lena's impact, tirelessly championed the standards and philosophies instilled by her mentor. The training center, once a mere idea, had become a cornerstone of the base's operational readiness, a testament to what could be achieved when true competence was allowed to flourish. The base commander, Colonel Williams, frequently cited Fort Benning's improved security posture as an example of innovative leadership, often attributing the cultural shift to, quote, the quiet revolution started by a civilian contractor. The true measure of Lena's success lay not in her own achievements, but in the enhanced capabilities of those she touched. Every successful mission, every avoided incident, every life saved by a well-trained soldier could, in some subtle way, be traced back to the lessons learned from the quiet instructor. She had transformed her personal tragedy into a profound, far-reaching legacy, ensuring that the sacrifices of her team were not in vain. Her purpose had become larger than herself, a quiet commitment to shaping a safer world, one precise movement, one focused mind, one prepared individual at a time. And when that service is complete, they fade back into the shadows where legends live, content in the knowledge that their duty continues through every life they have touched, every standard they have set, every lesson they have taught about the difference between excellence and expectation, between service and self-promotion, between earning respect and demanding it. The legacy lives on, whispered through the ranks of soldiers who learned precision from someone who understood its life-or-death importance. Carried forward by instructors who teach with the patience of someone who knows that preparation prevents tragedy, embodied in the culture of institutions that value competence over connections and results over rhetoric. Lena Petrova proved that true strength lies not in proving our worth to critics, but in continuing our work regardless of recognition. That the most powerful response to disrespect might be the quiet dignity of competence. That excellence speaks through actions, not arguments. And that the greatest warriors are often those who serve without fanfare, teach without ego, and measure success by the lives they help save rather than the glory they achieve. Her life became a living embodiment of these principles, a testament to the power of unwavering dedication and quiet resilience. She never sought the spotlight, yet her impact shone brighter than any medal or commendation. Her story, though largely unknown to the general public, became a cornerstone legend within specialized military and security circles. Her name, Spectre, was invoked with reverence, a symbol of unparalleled skill and quiet sacrifice. Commanders used her training methods as case studies, not just for tactical proficiency, but for cultivating the kind of leadership that prioritizes substance over showmanship. The story of the base security contractor who saved an entire squadron with a single shot at 800 meters was a detail known only to a select few, but its essence, the unexpected power of the unseen professional, permeated the culture she helped shape. Lena's journey closed the circle of her service. From the anonymity of a top-tier operator to the forced obscurity of a civilian contractor, and finally, to the quiet authority of an instructor, she found her ultimate purpose in safeguarding others. The sorrow of her past was transmuted into a driving force for the future, a commitment to ensuring that no other unit would suffer the fate of her own. Her life was a testament to the idea that some heroes don't need monuments. Their legacy is etched in the improved capabilities and continued safety of those they serve. She was just base security until her shot saved the entire squadron at 800 meters. And in doing so, she became something far more profound than a legend, a teacher, a guardian, a quiet force for excellence in a world that desperately needed it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.